Check it out. This is the Runcam Wasp. This camera is capable of 120 FPS, has a 28 millisecond low latency mode, has a nice and wide 4:3 aspect ratio, and offers some really solid dynamic range. Runcam has been coming out with some awesome cameras for the DJI system lately, and this is one you're definitely going to want to take a look at. So we'll do a very quick unboxing because I want to get to some flight footage. In the box you have the link unit, also known as the air unit light, and then you have the camera connected to that via this ribbon cable. You got some foam, we got a little user manual here, and then you get an antenna in the bottom as well as a cable to connect it to your flight controller, and then you also have some camera screws. So this probably doesn't have to be said, but I'll say it anyways. This camera only works when you're using the DJI digital system, so you're going to need a set of these goggles in order to use this. This camera won't work with analog goggles. So another thing I want to quickly mention before we get into the video, if you end up getting this setup, you probably won't have to update it. If you get just the camera and you plan on using it with an existing air unit that you have in a drone, just make sure you update the air unit to the latest version. Otherwise, it won't recognize this camera. So the camera is 19 by 19. The lens has a field of view of 155 degrees, which is a little bit wider than the stock DJI camera. And that one has a 150 degree field of view. With this camera, you're also going to get 120 FPS and a 28 millisecond low latency, which is exactly what the stock DJI camera offers. You're also going to get a 4:3 aspect ratio. That's going to give you a bigger image than a 16 by 9. So there's two cameras that I really wanted to compare side by side with the Wasp: the Nebula Pro Micro and the Polar Starlight. When you look at the specs of a Nebula Pro Micro and the Wasp, they are incredibly similar on paper. The main differences that I'm seeing is that the Wasp has a slightly wider field of view, and the Wasp doesn't offer a 16 by 9 mode, whereas the Nebula Pro does. If you're familiar with the Nebula Pro, you probably know that you have camera control in your goggles. Through this menu, you can adjust a lot of the camera's image settings like color, saturation, and aspect ratio. The Wasp doesn't offer that, and honestly, after testing this, I don't really think it needs it. Personally, I always use 4:3 if it's available because it's a bigger image, and that's what I prefer. The other camera that I was curious how this would compare to is the Caddx Polar Starlight. The Polar has 60 FPS and a bigger sensor, so I anticipate that the Polar will do better in low light, but you'll get better latency with the Wasp as well as a bigger overall image with the 4:3 aspect ratio. All three of these cameras have their benefits, but overall I think the Wasp is going to be a great hybrid between these two. So let's get to some flight footage and we'll compare these three cameras. Alright, so off the bat we got the Wasp versus the Nebula Pro. This is during the daytime, and you can see the Wasp has more contrast than the Nebula Pro. It also has more greens, and I feel like you can make out a little more detail in the Wasp. The Nebula Pro has a much warmer image than the Wasp. You can definitely see more detail on the ground in the Wasp versus the Nebula Pro there. Keep an eye on the skies. On the Nebula Pro, it gets very overexposed, whereas on the Wasp, you're able to see more blue. So that dynamic range is really showing itself when you can see these two side by side like that. Again, you can see more detail on these leaves on the ground than on the Wasp. Now you got the Wasp versus the Polar, and obviously the Polar is a nighttime camera, so this is going to be kind of a unique comparison. The colors are similar in the two during the day. When I turn this corner up here, you can see the dynamic range again with the sky. Just keep an eye on the Wasp. You can see all that blue up there, and even the ground is it's all evenly exposed, whereas on the Polar, the ground's pretty dark and the sky is pretty bright. And same thing here, the ground is pretty dark. You can't really see any of the sky, whereas the sky on the Wasp is pretty blue. Now we got the Wasp versus the Nebula Pro during sunset, so this is a little bit darker, still kind of daytime, but you can see the Nebula Pro, still a warmer image. The dynamic range on the Wasp is definitely outshining the Nebula Pro. The sky on the Nebula Pro is more white, whereas on the Wasp it's more blue. Keep an eye on the horizon as I turn the corner up here. There's like an orange strip right there, and it definitely separates itself more from the sky on the Wasp than it does on the Nebula Pro. And as I turn here, you can definitely see more detail on the ground on the Wasp. Now we got the Wasp versus the Polar. And this one, the Polar, definitely has more color. I like how the Wasp looks overall though, compared to the Polar here. Look at the Polar right now, it's very dark on the ground, whereas on the Wasp, it's very even. And on the Polar, I think it's more concentrated on the sunset than the ground, but it's gonna boost back up so you can see the adjustments more on the Polar, whereas with the Wasp, it has such good dynamic range that it's more of a consistent exposure, and it doesn't have that adjustment look to it. So at this point, the street light's turned on, and I'll pause it so you can see this. But when I pass in front of this street light, the way that the cameras adjust is interesting. Right there. So clearly right now you can see on the Wasp, everything is very evenly exposed. The ground you can see clearly, the sky you can see clearly, the street light that's right in front of me, you can make out the details on it. But then if you look at the Polar, the ground is very dark, and obviously that street light has become part of the sunset. So it's almost just like a white blob. You can't see the street light at all. It's just gonna become one with the sunset. So this screenshot right here, I think, is a great comparison between these two cameras. Keep an eye on the Polar when I'm gonna play it. The exposure does go up, and you can see it kind of stepping up as I pass this light. So it's still a little darker, and then it's kind of adjusting itself to be as bright as the Wasp. And as I pass through this tree up here, you can see a lot more detail on the Wasp than the Polar. So I think as far as the sunset flight goes between the Wasp and the Polar, I think the Wasp definitely takes the cake. Look at that. I'll pause it again, look at that. Look how dark the image is on the Polar compared to the Wasp. All right, now for some nighttime footage. Now this was about 20, maybe 30 minutes after sunset. So we got the Wasp and the Nebula Pro here. So when I was testing this, I was using the Wasp, and I actually wasn't able to really fly that good with the Nebula Pro. So that was kind of just telling me right then that the Wasp is better in low light than the Nebula Pro. And as I get up here and turn this corner, you're gonna see a lot more detail in the cement. Right about in here, you see more detail in these parking spots, and even in the leaves right here as I pass through on the Wasp over the Nebula Pro. You can also see more detail in this tree line up here, where you can make out the sky more on the Wasp than you can on the Nebula. Keep an eye on the Wasp. You're going to see the ISO step up right there. That's just the ISO stepping up, so it can get a little bit brighter. I think it does it again as I approach the trees. Yeah, it kind of flickered there. But you cannot see that detail on the Nebula Pro, but you can see it on the Wasp. Again, this isn't marketed as a nighttime camera, so I didn't really expect it to do that great at nighttime, but it's definitely doing better than the Nebula Pro. As I go up here, keep an eye on this tall tree on the right-hand side. You can definitely see more detail in that on the Wasp than you can on the Nebula. On the Nebula, it's very dark, whereas on the Wasp, it was a little bit brighter. Now we got the Wasp versus the Polar. And obviously, like I said earlier, the Polar is a nighttime camera, so I knew it was gonna do better than the Wasp. This was kind of just for my own curiosity. When I was filming this, I was using the Polar just because you can see so much better at nighttime. If you're looking for a nighttime camera, I don't think the Wasp is the one you really should be looking at. I think you should be looking at a Polar. When you look at them side by side, obviously the Polar is going to do much better. It has 60 FPS. 60 FPS is naturally just going to do better in low light. It also has a bigger sensor, so you can see those trees very clearly on the Polar, whereas on the Wasp you can't really see it. And just for shits, I flew a little closer just to see what it would look like on the Polar versus the Wasp. And you can actually see a lot of detail on the Polar, whereas on the Wasp, it's too dark to tell what you're doing. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave the video a like, and if you have any questions about the Runcam Wasp, leave a comment down below.